Hi, and welcome to FTI Experts Hub, CP's quarterly podcast series that brings you the latest from FTI Consulting specialists. I'm Senior Editor Laura Valean. In recent years, there's been a surge of attention toward alternative assets in the commercial real estate sector, with data centers taking center stage. At FTI Consulting, Senior Managing Director and leader of the Real Estate Tax Advisory Group, McRae Thompson, has been advising on data center real estate development matters nationwide in projects and transactions totaling millions of square feet in size and billions of dollars in value to date. Over the next few minutes, the two of us will discuss how a data center deal gets done and what it takes for a data center project to become reality. Welcome to FTI Experts Hub, McRae. Thank you for making the time to speak with me.
You're welcome. I appreciate the invitation.
Let's dive right into one of the topics that have been all over the news lately, tariffs. How do current tariffs on imported construction materials and technology components impact the financial feasibility of data center development?
Yeah, there's significant concerns around the importation of GPUs in particular. You can see there's like company-specific deals that people are trying to strike, really to address this specifically, Apple, Intel, NVIDIA. So I think on the GPU piece is very significant because of the dollar value associated with the GPUs. You also see, other impacts on servers, racking equipment, construction materials. But again, I think the GPUs is definitely the biggest one. Probably the most interesting thing about this is just trying to track and apply the correct tariff rate. And that might sound a little bit, interesting, but it's very complex. The rates are constantly changing. There's product-specific exemptions. There's country-specific exemptions. And all of this is kind of laid out in, and it's laid out in executive orders, which it's not even like a statute. And those executive orders coming from Trump are always changing. So things are expiring, extending. So just knowing what the right number is honestly one of the biggest challenges. But even though the tariffs are huge, I think what we see is people are betting on AI and where it's going. So even when you are potentially facing a large tariff, it's not necessarily stopping people from developing data centers because it's a long-term play, right? It could be 5 to 7 years before that data center goes into service. So it's not necessarily stopping the activity.
Taxes are also not stopping nobody. They're not stopping developers. Can you break down the role of state and local taxes in shaping site selection decisions for developers?
Yeah, they're very significant. There's so many ways to participate in a data center development. So the way taxes work can be very different depending on where you are in the chain, the value chain, I would say. So you could have a simple data center land developer. They may just be subject to income tax, but they're not necessarily going to directly benefit from a lot of the other types of taxes and tax incentives that are out there. Then you move to someone who's maybe developing and owning the data center, but not operating it. For them, it's typically more the ad valorem type taxes. So the annual taxes based on property value that could be, real property for their specific situation. It definitely has a big impact. I would say the data center operators are the ones that really are facing the largest taxes and the largest potential for incentives. A lot of that is driven by sales and use tax. But they can also be subject to ad valorem property taxes on personal property specifically. And I would just say the magnitude of these taxes, when you start looking at this over multiple decades, it can be billions of dollars. So they're very significant financial opportunities or challenges. We also see a lot of tax opportunities or incentives around job creation, whether that's payroll withholding benefits. Sometimes there's favorable financing arrangements you can get out of a state and local governmental body. Access to labor, state income tax credits, utility tax savings. So there's lots of different ones, and they're different in every single jurisdiction. So really depending on where you are in the value chain, how you're participating in the data center, and where that data center is located, all of that affects what taxes might be at play and also what incentives are there. The interesting thing about a lot of this is, a lot of these incentives around taxes are not even specific to a taxpayer. It might be specific to a project. So in
Hmm.
some cases, it actually requires collaboration between the person that owns the land, the person that builds the data center, the person that operates the data center. And that's really a big pitfall that we see, is that lack of collaboration in some cases can cause people to pay excess taxes.
But there are also lots of incentives that are trying to entice developers to keep building. What types of economic incentives are most effective in attracting developers to particular regions in the US? Because there are some specific regions where data center development is more common.
Yeah, the single biggest one from a financial perspective is sales and use tax. And again, that may be more applicable, while it can apply to construction materials, so it can be applicable to the developer. It definitely applies to the importation of the data center support equipment, and that number can be really, really large. It can also apply to power purchases. So generally speaking, no matter where you are in the value chain, I think sales and use tax is clearly, the largest tax, and therefore also the largest potential exemption. Kind of a non-tax incentive is just, working with a government that's going to help you, make sure that you have the power secured, um, you know, entitlements and, different factors around developing the data center. So kind of ease of approvals essentially. So there's a lot of intangible incentives aside from tax incentives that, really do drive where people are actually trying to build data centers today in the US.
And which of these incentives are statutory? Which ones can be negotiated at a local level? Also, are municipalities usually flexible in these negotiations?
Yeah, so generally speaking, the statutory incentives are typically state level incentives where the state has the ability to pass a law that affects, the entire state. The more negotiated incentives are typically the local level taxes. So at the state level, usually the state will administer sales and use taxes, so they can implement laws to kind of generate those benefits without the, negotiated approval from a local jurisdiction. Typically, the local jurisdictions are in control of administering property taxes. So that's really where a lot of the negotiations come in. From the state perspective, I think over 35 states in the U.S. currently have kind of a statutory data center, targeted program right now. The negotiated incentives come into play whether or not you're in those jurisdictions that have the statutory incentives. And when you start talking negotiated incentives, it's a lot more complex. You're typically talking about pilot programs, industrial revenue bonds, different types of incentives that are just not, cookie cutter and straightforward. Probably the most interesting thing is, when you're entering into a jurisdiction, you have to consider the state, the county, the city, and then there's kind of an economic development board or authority that kind of interacts with all three of those things. So you could be negotiating with 3 or 4 people at a time, essentially, and it can be very complex. I do find this, depending on the locality and their appetite for, investing in tech in the future, they could be very flexible actually. But at the same time, there's a lot of public, pushback and other things that can affect that. So it's kind of a revolving door, I would say. Like, while one county or state or one locality might be flexible one day, it might not be, the next day, just because of, other incentives it might have already offered, and or the, kind of the public reaction to those incentives.
Hmm. And is there any way developers can quantify the value of incentives when they evaluate a site for future development?
Yeah, we typically tell people to approach these like a large scale capital market transaction. I mean, the size of the data centers that we see being developed are constantly becoming larger. As I mentioned before, the benefits can be in the billions if you start looking out over a long period of time. So yeah, we're doing pretty complex underwriting using present value kind of concepts. It's really interesting because it's very forward looking. It's got lots of assumptions, and you're basically modeling out the impact of a data center that the size of which doesn't even exist in some cases today, just based on what people are trying to build. So it's very challenging, lots of assumptions, but at the same time, that's the information that the governments are requiring in order to approve the incentives. So it's an interesting process for sure.
And from your experience so far, how much do incentives actually move the needle in terms of location decisions? Is there a threshold where the cost benefit becomes compelling?
Yeah, I think all things being equal, they have a major impact, or all other things being equal, they have a major impact because again, you could be talking hundreds of millions into the billions of dollars. It doesn't cost that much to go pursue the incentive. So in terms of just the cost benefit analysis, it generally always makes sense to go for it. But I would also say, the need for compute power outweighs pretty much any financial incentive that you can find. So again, since people are making bets that might be, 5, 7, 10 years out, I would say while it does sway decisions, from a business perspective, if you need computing power, you may or may not pursue the incentive, in order to get the right site for your data center.
Can you explain how pilot programs, and I think you briefly touched on this before, how they work in the context of data center development and what makes them attractive to investors?
Yeah, generally speaking, the pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes. So essentially, you're replacing an annual ad valorem property tax with some lesser payment that's negotiated with a state and local jurisdiction. It might be a percentage of what you would have otherwise paid. It might just be a fixed amount. But again, it's usually a fraction of what you would have otherwise paid in property taxes. A lot of times the pilots involve either it could be a public bond issuance, it could be a sale leaseback with a local government. The sale leasebacks are interesting because not all laws allow for the incentives that the data center developers are looking for. So one workaround might be to sell the property to a local jurisdiction that's exempt from tax. And then they may own it in title for a period of time just so that the data center developer can obtain the incentive that they're looking for. The other thing that's interesting about the pilots is they're just much more customized. So, there may be something specific to a business that is not, captured or addressed by a statutory incentive. So that's when you start looking into the customized incentives, to try to figure out like, how do I address the need of the specific party that's trying to develop the data center? They're definitely heavily negotiated, and probably what's interesting about them though is, because it's not statutory, a lot of times it involves public approval and or votes. So it becomes, very publicized and political. But again, usually there's more benefit. So people do pursue these types of incentives, over statutory incentives on a pretty common basis.
While we're still on incentives, considering the rise of AI workloads, the high energy consumption, are energy efficiency incentives still relevant today?
Yeah, obviously the one big beautiful bill killed a lot of the federal tax incentives for developing energy efficient property. There's still state programs that are offered that do yield a benefit, and a lot of these have been in place for a long time. But I would say, beyond the actual benefits, I mean, sustainability is a major factor in community acceptance of a project. And in many cases, before any state and local government's going to agree to any type of incentive, they're going to demand, that sustainability issues are addressed. They understand the impacts to the local community. So I think it's critical, and beyond taxes, right? I think sustainability is still at the forefront, very much so. The other issue is just power consumption. I mean, data centers require a lot of power, so they need to be efficient. So even if there's not some federal, state, or local benefit to being energy efficient, it's probably still the right business answer because you need to kind of efficiently use power as much as possible.
You said there are lots of moving parts, lots of parts that need to negotiate for this for data center development to become a reality, and there's a lot of capital required for the development itself. how are market participants structuring these investments to maximize these tax advantages? And what role do REITs, private equity, sovereign wealth funds play in financing these projects?
Yeah, I would say data centers are not new. They're just becoming much larger and more, complex. So a lot of the just traditional structuring, strategies that we've always seen, you still see. So there's obviously a lot of public REITs in the space. Lots of asset managers have always been investing in data centers using private REITs, fund structures. So I would say, there's always been a lot of institutional investor interest, and that hasn't changed. Probably the more interesting thing is, the large corporates are trying to make sure they can control the data center. So whether you're talking about a hyperscaler, a neo cloud company, some kind of an end user, the more interesting thing is how they're participating in these deals and trying to maintain control. In a lot of cases, because of the capital required, they don't want these on balance sheets. So you're starting to see a lot of off balance sheet type arrangements. Even situations where you might see a hyperscaler, seed a fund essentially just to bring in private capital. So I don't know that the strategies have changed per se. It's just the participants have changed a little bit. And then again, you're kind of seeing, the end user participate in structures where in the past that would have just been isolated to institutional capital or a public company or a public REIT.
In many cases, some of the investors come from abroad. The U.S. is a magnet for foreign investment in data centers. Can you tell me more about the major international players entering the market and what world regions they're coming from?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of sovereign capital from the Middle East. We're also seeing a lot of just tech companies from Europe coming in specifically. There's also companies from Asia, so it's really all over the globe coming into the U.S. I think Trump visited the UK, signed a technology prosperity deal that's meant to drive more activity between our countries. He visited the Middle East recently, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. They announced Project Stargate. So there's really a lot. Probably the interesting thing about all of this is just kind of the perception of public-private partnership involving a U.S. federal government. So again, I think Trump is trying to attract as much of this activity as possible to be the AI leader, and so it's pretty much coming from everywhere, I would say.
Mhm. Are there any specific advantages that make the U.S. particularly attractive to foreign investors in this sector?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is the demand, right? So the U.S. is the largest consumer of computing power in the world. So
Of
everybody's
course.
coming here because they know, that they're going to be able to sell computing power in the United States. We're the leader in the AI field, so we must have the computing power to maintain that advantage. I think the other things that help is, we have a relatively favorable tax regime that's established, streamlined regulatory. So there are things that make it easier to do business here. Now, at the same time, there's other things out there that could impact this in a negative way in the future. And specifically, there was a talk about a revenge tax that the United States was going to put into place, essentially to tax other countries that the U.S. deems are taxing U.S. taxpayers unfairly.
Mhm.
So if that comes back into play, that could definitely impact, inbound investment into the United States by non-U.S. companies. So there's advantages and challenges, I guess I would say, but generally speaking, it all goes back to demand.
Course. You mentioned challenges. What are some of the most common ones on a community level that developers need to face when they build data centers? How are they navigating that local opposition or zoning hurdles?
Yeah, it's sustainability, as I mentioned, noise, pollution, electric consumption, and what the impact of that consumption might be on the cost of electricity to the broader public. Could be water usage, job creation. There's lots of issues, and it can be very specific, to the locality you're dealing with. A lot of these incentives and really just the permitting requires public approval. So I think, what we're seeing is data center developers are trying to engage with the local community early and often. And what I've personally witnessed is, people really trying to establish a true partnership with a community where there is some sort of agreement, and it is very clear what is the community going to get out of this beyond having a data center.
Right.
So it's it's an interesting process.
And looking ahead, how do you see tax policy and incentive structures evolving as a response to the growing demand for AI infrastructure and hyperscale data centers?
Yeah, it's really interesting in the U.S. I mean, we see state and local programs arising in order to attract the investment, but then at the same time, we see others rolling back, maybe because they got too much investment, and maybe because the public isn't liking the data center. So, in the U.S. at least, it's constantly changing where those locations are. They're the most business friendly. Again, I think if most tech-friendly type jurisdictions are going to continue to bet on the future and continue to enhance their incentive programs, I think probably the other thing that's going to be interesting is just digital service taxes, and this is kind of a U.S. and a global concept. But when you have a value-added service, who should really pay the tax, on that service? Should it be the provider? Should it be the recipient? Should it be based on the location of one of those two people? So I think globally, people are still trying to figure out, right, how to tax digital services. And I think that's going to be really big in the future because, yes, there's a lot of lost revenue on the incentive side potentially. But people do need to figure out, how are we going to make up for that lost revenue with additional revenues? And I think the digital services taxes are clearly, going to be something that you see more of.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing all these thoughts with our listeners. I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. If you liked this episode, please rate and review it on the podcast platform you're using. For the latest news, trend stories, and podcasts, check out cpexecutive.com every day. I also encourage you to subscribe to our recently relaunched YouTube page, which includes exclusive interviews with high-profile executives in the commercial real estate industry. Till next time.